Hey everyone, thank you for joining us for this Unity Unite session titled Small Teams, Big Communities, Overcoming Challenges with Assets. I'm Hasan Salman, Program Manager for Live Content at Unity, and the goal of today's talk is to inspire creators everywhere to explore the Asset Store community, whether that's as a game creator or as a publisher who's building content for the store. To do that, I'm joined by two extremely talented individuals. I'm very excited to have them here. They're game development heavyweights who you probably already know. And if you don't, you've probably come across their work. So I'm here with Freya Holmér and Renaud and Forestié, both hugely successful Asset Store publishers, and it's my pleasure to have them. So let's do a quick round of intros. Freya, can you tell us a bit about yourself and what you're working on these days?
Sure. My name is Freya Holmér, and I am a technical artist and slash generalist indie developer. Yeah. I've been using Unity for about 12 years now, and I'm probably mostly known as the creator of ShaderForge, a shader editor. And more recently, I created a plugin called Shapes, which is like a vector graphics library for Unity. I also co-founded the studio behind the VR game Budget Cuts. But since then, I have left. And these days, I am a teacher and I make educational tech art and math videos and streams.
All right, so you're doing just a few things, You dabble in a few things here and there.
I do, yeah. It's really hard to remember everything I do. That was like not even half of it. So,
no,
you know.
I love that. And I just have to say I'm a huge fan of Shapes and I've been using it a lot on my personal projects. So
nice.
It's amazing. And we're also joined by Renaud. Pleasure to have you here. Maybe you can introduce yourself to everyone.
Yeah, super happy to be here. I'm Renaud and I make games. By day, these days, I'm directing an unannounced project at Ubisoft Montreal. And at night, I do stuff for the Asset Store. I create assets under the name of More Mountains. And you may have heard of the top-down engine or the Corgi engine or Feel, that kind of stuff. That's what I do.
Absolutely, just incredible assets. And I was lucky enough to interview on one of the Unity's creator spotlights, and we looked at Feel in like great detail, and just an amazing tool for getting your game feeling like really juicy, essentially, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so it's a pleasure having you. Thank you so much for joining with obviously extremely busy schedules. So I was wondering, you've been doing this for a while. Freya, you mentioned you starting with ShaderForge. Renaud, I believe you started with Corgi Engine. That might have been your first one, right?
That's correct.
I'm wondering what your first interaction with the Asset Store was like. Did you start as a publisher right off the bat, or did you start as users? Freya, maybe you can take this one first.
I think for me, my goal was never to make assets. It's kind of like I was just doing game development. And for me, I had recently switched from the Unreal Engine to Unity. And I was sorely missing a shader editor. I really enjoyed working with like the visual node-based editors in Unreal. Yeah. And so my motivation to go to the Asset Store was just that I wanted a shader editor. that was my motivation. And then I just so happened to be in a position where I could turn that into something I could sell. And so I guess the Asset Store was kind of already there, allowing me to share it with other people and, you know, not just make a tool for myself, because obviously this is something that other people would want to.
Absolutely. So when you started making it, did you start making it for yourself and then change it to work for other people? Or as soon as you had the idea, you're like, you know what, I'm going to build this for myself and for others?
I think personally, I like polishing things a little bit too much. Okay. And so I spent a lot of time making it like very like user-friendly and nice to use and read, and like adding unnecessary features, like trying to make the editor, like the output of the shader editor. I wanted that code to also be readable, so you could like use it as a learning tool for programming shaders. So like I had a lot of like lofty goals that weren't just for me. And so I think it was kind of already from the start. As soon as I started working on it, it was like, okay, I can see the potential in this tool. I can see that there's a lot of people that would want this. Unity didn't really have a shader editor at the time. There was Strumpy shader editor, but Strumpy was not visual. There was no like visual preview of every node along the way. That's right. And so to me, I felt like that kind of defeats the purpose, because like the whole point of a node-based editor for shaders is that you can actually visually see what you're doing. And so I think for me, I wanted to make a tool that could help artists leverage shaders, because like that was just really hard to do before. So
Right, and from my understanding, shader code is way different than regular code. So even for people maybe used to coding in C#, it might seem like something that's a bit hard to access, hard to reach out of their grasp, right?
Oh yeah, a little bit. I
Yeah.
think at the time the shader documentation was very lacking as well. So it was super opaque, and kind of like the only way to learn how to write shaders in Unity was to like open up Unity's shaders, like to
Right.
see how did Unity write this, and then you can learn from them. And so it was very difficult to get into shaders at the time. And even if you are a programmer, then like sure, you can sort of read shaders maybe, but the problem is that shaders is so math heavy. Like it's full of vector math and esoteric color math and that kind of stuff. And I think for a lot of people that's kind of intimidating. And so yeah, I think, but for me, my goal was to give artists the possibility to make shaders, because I think fundamentally artists should be able to make shaders. I think it's a very fun thing to do. It gives you a lot more like creative ways to express yourself and like design the aesthetic of your game. And it really makes it stand out in, there's kind of a stereotype of like the Unity look or the Unreal look. And I think the key there is shaders. Like if you use the stock shaders for everything, of course it's going to look like stock shaders.
Yes.
And so I think what I wanted to do was give people the ability to kind of push beyond, the default look. And yeah, so that was my goal.
That's amazing. Yeah, you're really empowering the artist rather than have an artist connect or communicate with a technical artist or with a programmer. They get to just take it into their own hands and get like closer to the final result. From brain to final result, bring that connection closer. I love that. That's fantastic.
For better or worse, sometimes.
For better, hopefully. And Renaud, how about yourself? What was your first interaction with the asset store?
That's a good question. I think one of the first products I bought on the store was Shader Forge, actually, because I was really bad at shaders at the time, and I improved a bit, but not too much ever since. And as a publisher, my first asset was the Corgi engine. Initially, a failed attempt at making a game. And then I realized that, it would be the scope of what I had planned was just too much for me and my patience. And at work, my real job for the past 15 years has been to make things super fast. I do prototypes and I try to get to market as fast as possible. So I don't get to polish things as much as I like. And putting this on the store, I discovered that I could actually spend billions of hours polishing this thing forever, because that's what actually people expected. Something that works regardless of the potential combinations of abilities and weapons and whatever you put into your game. And doing that while also doing fast games during the day, I get to do the two things I love the most, which is ship a lot of stuff and craft perfect gems. So it's been a good experience.
That's incredible. And so you started with Corgi engine, right? And so
yes,
what brought you to build that specifically?
Initially, I wanted to make a platformer game, like an actual game, not an asset for the store. And it was just too much level design, too much. I wasn't that interested in producing the content. I was interested in producing the engine. And once I had that, I was like, well, I'm never going to finish that game. But people seemed interested in like, oh, can I play with your stuff? So I just put it on the store, hoping it would make a few bucks and I could buy, I think at the time it was Far Cry 4. It wasn't working for Ubisoft at the time. Now I would get it for free. But it made more than 40 bucks and people were really into it. So I kept adding more features and just the fact that I got, enough people buying it that I could afford to spend the time to perfect it and keep working on it was super rewarding. And now I get to reach a level of perfection that I wouldn't have reached if it had been production code, that I would just have shipped the game, moved on.
I see. And so I see a common theme here is that you were both like working to build something for yourselves. The drive was to make something for yourself, and then you were like, hey, you know what? Like this could be useful for other people.
Oh, yeah,
And then
absolutely. If it's useful for you, like it's usually a good sign. If it's not, maybe rethink your business model.
right. And then you moved from Corgi engine to top-down engine. So was it that you thought, hey, okay, this was successful, and now let me try it from a different, like I'm getting requests for a different perspective or something like that, or like to do it top-down, or were you again trying to make something for yourself?
No, I wish there was a big marketing plan, but it's just I'm doing stuff for myself first.
Okay.
And I love top-down games, specifically top-down action games. Let's say Hotline Miami and Binding of Isaac, that kind of stuff.
Absolutely love those games.
And I was like, okay, well, I'm spending a lot of time on this platformer thing, but what if I could get people to sort of pay me to do the perfect top-down framework, and that's how it started. And I've used it for actual games or actual killed games now, but I've used it quite a lot in my day job.
And I believe you're big into game jams, right? Like you do a lot of game jams. Can you tell me a little bit about that and how that's informed like these projects?
The second asset I think I put on the store was the High Road engine, and that's like a very minimalistic and simple by design car controller, and so and a bunch of other features, and that comes directly from a game I made for Ludum Dare 30 something called Shapeshifter Biker, where you would play a biker that shapeshifts into animals every 10 seconds for no good reason, but you turn into a koala and then an eagle and then
makes sense.
I don't know, the crocodile.
And
it was a fun game, and that's basically the basis of the engine. And the top-down engine comes from the one I did 3 months after that, called Smallest Dungeon, and it was like Zelda / Binding of Isaac, but you don't control anyone. And it was sort of an idle game before idle games.
I see. And for anyone who doesn't know, the Ludum Dare game jam takes place over 2 days, right?
2 days. 2 days, and there's like two modes. You can do the jam or the compo, and I was doing the hardcore 48 hours, no previous existing code, no existing assets, no nothing. So you get to start from scratch.
Sorry, yeah. And in that short amount of time, you had already built the framework for the tool that you had on the store. I
had built the interest in myself for building the framework. The code of that was crap, but I was like, okay, well, that's interesting, that's fun to work on. I can turn that into a bigger tool.
I think it's fascinating because you're kind of taking the assumptions out of it, out of like, will people want to use this? Because you're kind of proving it to yourself in the first place. You're like, oh, I see the use case for this. I've already wanted to use this tool. I am a customer. I myself am a customer, and so why wouldn't others in my place want to use the same thing? So I feel like that kind of takes the guesswork out of it.
If I had more budget, I guess I would do user interviews and reach out, to people and stuff. But that's a lot of work, and also it's boring. If I'm my own boss, so I get to do things the way I want, and I just get to work on the stuff I like. That's my marketing plan.
Yeah, and then Freya, after working on Shader Forge, I guess there was a bit of a gap there, and then later you came back to the asset store, kind of recently, about 2 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe, and you came out with a new tool. Can you tell us a little bit about that, and what was the inspiration for coming back to the store and making this specific tool?
So like I mentioned, I went into doing a lot of like educational content. I have a bit of a fascination with like visualizing mathematics and things that, just mathematical concepts, tech art, that kind of stuff. Because really, once you dig deep into shaders, a lot of shaders is about kind of visualizing math. Like the way you debug something is to draw it as a color. And so I found that fascinating, and I've always had an interest for that kind of math visualization. And then I started doing like little animations that I mostly shared on just Twitter. Like, here's the animation for, the Pythagorean theorem, or here's an animation for what the bisector of an angle means in a triangle, and that kind of stuff. And so I made these animations in Unity. And the what I kind of realized was that I felt like Unity was lacking tools for drawing basic shapes. It sounds so simple. Like, it's just like, but like, if you're thinking about like, I want to make a project in Unity, and you're like, okay, I want to draw a circle. How do I do that? Like, if you want to explain that to someone, you're like, oh, shit. Oh, geez. Okay, well, I guess you can import a texture of a circle, to like draw a circle, and then you like scale it up, and then it looks like bilinearly filtered and ugly. And they're like, oh, okay, I guess I want it to be nicely filtered. And they're, oh, I guess you could write a shader that does a nicely looking circle that you can scale. And then you have to learn shaders. Then you have to like know how to do that. And then you're like, okay, what if I want to make it not, a full disc? What if I want to make it a ring with a border? And now it's another whole thing you have to learn. And so I found myself a little frustrated that like, if I wanted to do math visualizations in Unity, that was really hard. Like, I had to make a lot of like customized shaders. But if I go to something like HTML5, like Canvas has all of these things built in. It's just like draw a line from A to B, draw a circle, draw a polyline, that kind of stuff. Like, it's all just there. And so I guess for me, I was just like making all of these math animations, and I started writing all of these shaders for my own work. And then I sort of saw the potential in that kind of stuff, even for games, because there's a lot of games that have like in-game like UI shapes and pop-ups and whatnot. Like, maybe you're hovering over a button in the world, and then you want to make like a little circle appear that maybe has like an animation and like dynamically changes size and thickness and color, that kind of stuff. And doing that in general is kind of annoying in game dev unless you have those kinds of shaders. And so I ended up basically making a library for drawing vector graphics. And so that's what Shapes turned out to be. And yeah, the reason I went to the asset store is just because it started growing to a very useful tool that I could sort of see how it could apply to games as well.
And I found that the visualizations you were doing for like your math diagrams, you were visualizing equations and things like this. And I thought that acted as a great marketing tool for the tool, right? Like, and people were like, how do I get my hands on this? Like, this looks incredible. How did you make this? And you're, with a little winky face, you'd be like, oh, maybe you'll get your hands on this soon as well. Was that intentional at all, or do you think that just happened naturally?
It's not super intentional, but I mean, after especially after I left Nicorp, I kind of became some sort of online influencer, whatever that means. And so I'm very public with everything I do, for better or for worse. And so like, when I'm working on this, I just tweet about it all the time, just like showing pretty pictures or animations or whatever. I think after Shaderforge, I already got like an established game developer audience. So for me, the marketing, I'm in a privileged position where I can just kind of rely on word of mouth, because like, people know me from Shaderforge, have a lot of game developer followers, especially on Twitter. And so I could sort of just lean on that. Yeah,
and that's something that I think a lot of people coming to the asset store for the first time, it's like a big question that comes up. It's like, okay, I've made my asset. How do I put it out there? How do I get people to use it for the first time? And of course, there's no easy answer to that question, but it doesn't hurt to hear others' stories and get inspiration from them, right? And so, Renaud, I'm wondering, like, when you first put out like Corgi Engine and Top Down, how did people find it in the first place?
That's a good question that I don't have the answer to. I'm on Twitter as well. I would show my stuff there, but I don't think that many people found the Corgi engine from it. I honestly don't know. I don't have the data to tell. I think people found it from the store itself, found it from YouTube maybe. I would put tutorials and trailers and stuff over there, and I'm guessing the biggest source was word of mouth. People just some people started using it and were like, hey, this is cool.
Yeah, and had you put the trailer out at the time? Was it like I think you had a very visual trailer showcasing.
I've got experience launching products outside of the asset store, and I'm fortunate enough that I can do illustration and video and all that stuff myself. So I would say it's actually the fun part, making the trailer and making all the marketing assets. For me, it's easy, and I have a good time doing it. So doing a trailer is mandatory, I would say, and in my process at least, and something I would recommend doing. Even at 30, and I would say do a 30-second trailer. My initial promotion stuff for the asset store was 6 minutes trailers going very deep into the stuff. Now I do like the last trailer for Phil is under 1 minute, and the asset has become way bigger. But the shorter you make it, I think, as long as you get your point across, it's good enough.
Absolutely. You want to make them feel something from the trailer. No pun intended.
I see what you did there.
Yeah. I only noticed what I did there after I did it, but I'm very proud of myself. Sorry, go ahead. No, please go ahead.
No, so I was just going to say that like the fact that I was able to lean on my existing audience, I can only do that for Shapes, but not for Shader Forge. Because with Shader Forge, I was relatively unknown in the industry still. And so I think the way that I reached an audience with Shader Forge was that I think that obviously you should never listen for tips like from people who are successful. Like there's like most people are just lucky and you can't always trust them. So don't trust me. That being said, here's my guess. I think Shader Forge was kind of like the right place at the right time. There was a gap in the tool set that people had. Strumpy Shader Editor existed, and then Tim Cooper started working for Unity, who worked on Strumpy Shader Editor. So I think everyone was sort of expecting Unity to release their own shader editor like very soon. Then Tim started working on the UI system. And so like nobody was working on the shader editor for quite a long time. And so I think I was just kind of lucky in that there were no other asset store creators that were looking to make a shader editor, because I think it would have been a bad business decision because Unity was going to make their own anyway. So there was that. And the second thing was that I know my audience. Like my audience is not programmers. My audience is artists. Right. And I have a lot of artist friends and people who are in those community. And to some extent, I'm an artist myself. So I sort of know what communities artists hang out in. And so one thing I did before the release of Shader Forge was that I created a thread on Polycount, which is a 3D artist forum or just game dev artist forum in general. And so on Polycount, I kind of just talk to users like, what would you want in a shader editor? What kind of features do you need? Here's my plan. This is what I have so far, and kind of like showing things off and whatnot to get people interested. And that thread grew very large, like even before I'd released Shader Forge. I also did like internal, like private testing with people there, which was really, really useful. So I think like at the time when I just released it on the asset store, there was already an existing like user base of people who really wanted it. So that was kind of the approach for Shader Forge.
Yeah, so from what I take from both of you, I feel like two things we can learn from there are like, obviously find a gap in the market, look at what people are constantly asking for and missing. And then also something you both do excellently is like having promotional material out there for your work, just having it ready for people to find, right? Having stuff up on YouTube, having stuff up on Twitter, and a great asset store page. Basically, if maybe the trailer on Twitter won't do so great, but it might, pop off on YouTube or something like that. So it's good to just cover all your bases and put the effort in to create that content for people to find. One thing I think really is interesting is then how you went on to make Feel, like when you went from creating these engines and then moving on to Feel. And I think the story behind that is a bit interesting and why you decided to create that. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. I've been making games and apps and interactive stuff, let's say, for a long time now. And my passion has always been micro interaction. So it's the idea that, you know, the system or the user or the player does something to the system, and the system lets you know that that action happened. It can be that, you know, a new minute passed on your clock, or that you pressed the button, or that you got an email, and so on. So all these events, you want to give feedback to the user and let them know that something happened. And what I love is crafting these micro interactions and just tweaking, you know, having a sound, a small haptic, maybe a small vibration of the button, and it scales up a bit. And it's the more subtle it is, and the more time I get to tweak these, the more happy I am. And when working on games in Unity, I found out that I was always relying on the same tricks, on the same techniques, a screen shake, playing a sound, and maybe bumping a bit the bloom, and, you know, that kind of stuff. I had my gimmicks and my routines, and I had some tools to do that. But I found myself repeating that a lot. And I also figured out that, to me, that sort of came naturally, because it's like a passion. But at studios, you will find excellent game designers and excellent VFX artists and excellent artists in general, but nobody's in charge of juice, and nobody's in charge of game feel, and or everybody is. But there was a bit of a lack of both, I would say, culture and also know-how. Like, I would just say, you know, people would come for advice and be like, oh, you seem to know your stuff when it comes to game feel. What can we do to improve this and that? And I would say, well, just add a camera shake. How do we do that? And that's when I realized that these teams that were usually extremely capable technically were focusing on stuff that was very technical, like, you know, networking and shaders and all that good stuff. But nobody was doing that work that technically isn't that hard, but is essential if you want to craft something that is pleasing for the player. And that's when I was like, okay, well, this, I guess there's at least a tool for myself, first and foremost. And if I manage to have that, I'm going to improve my day to day. And then I saw the response. Initially, it wasn't even an asset on its own. It was part of the core engine and part of top down. And people were like, oh, can I buy that separately? Because I really don't care for your platformer thing, but this is really good. And that's how it became Feedbacks first. And then I renamed that to Feel, because the naming of your asset on the store is important. And if you name it Feedback, people are going to be like, oh, is it like a feedback form? Is it? No, so it's Feel.
That's a good point. That's a good tip.
And actually, I don't know if Feel is a better name, but at least it's shorter.
I think it looks great now. I like these one-word names: shapes, feel. You know, just keep it simple.
Keep it simple.
Well, I actually do think there's a lot of parallels between shapes and feel, and that, like, Freya, you were very eloquently describing how, you know, if you wanted to do what shapes does for you before shapes existed, you would have to dive in there and, you know, apply a shader, and then maybe it's not what you like, and so now you have to do a different version. And same thing for game feel. You would like, okay, maybe this should be squishy, you know, and then you're like, no, maybe it should like be more impactful. And then you go through this long process of, you know, connecting the animator to Cinemachine and doing this, and like you're doing things maybe the long way, you could say. And what both of these tools allow you to do is just to like iterate quickly, again, enable artists to quickly test things out and see how they feel, to prototype in a way, right? So like, okay, as you said, I want a disc. Actually, I want the disc to be filled. You know what? I want it to be a stamina bar that slowly turns into a pie as you're losing stamina. And I love that it kind of enables that. And was that something you decided to do from the get-go? Like, this is going to be all about like iteration. Was that kind of like a guiding principle for both of these assets, or did it just kind of become that way?
I feel like that's kind of inherent to most tools. Like the tools should make it easier to do the thing that you want to do.
Yeah.
And so that you get results quicker. And I think that's the key part for iteration. Like if you see a result and you're like, it doesn't look super good, then you can just quickly test something else if the asset has a lot of different options. Whereas if you write it by hand, took you a long time to get just to that point of the first iteration. So like changing it at that point is kind of like, oh God, I have to rewrite this whole thing. So then you're just like, okay, we don't have time. I'm just going to move on to the next thing that we have to do because schedule, you know? But as soon as you have a tool for something, it's so much easier to iterate. And so I think it sort of goes for any tool, really.
Absolutely. I don't know.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's and in the case of Phil, it's impossible, I think, to craft these kinds of interactions without a good tool to iterate. And what I've found very surprising is that I've worked at big studios where these directives for game feel would end up in a game design document. And so maybe 6 months before somebody implements actually the thing, you would have in the document saying, well, we should have a screen shake of 0.2 seconds, and we should have this and this and that happening. And that's not something you should do on paper, in my opinion. You should just say, well, do something meaningful. We want a big feedback for the player because this is really big, while getting one more coin in Mario, maybe just a small feedback, you know. And you as a game designer, you should give the scale, but you shouldn't write all the properties because on paper it won't work. You need something, you need a tool. You can use Phil, or you can use or create your own, you know, good luck.
Yeah.
But it's really something that needs iteration to be able to be done, really.
Yeah, I think there's kind of a sense of discovery where you might even discover ideas that you wouldn't even have thought
Absolutely.
of. Like if you're thinking about something like screen shake is a good example where like you might imagine that 0.2 seconds is the perfect one because you used that in a different game and it worked well there, or you heard from someone that that's the ideal amount or whatever. But I think there are a lot of kind of like happy accidents that you get when you have the possibility to iterate very easily, where you might even land in like counterintuitive things that work really well. Like, I don't know, something you can like think of like fighting games. They have the concept of like freeze frames when you hit someone. Like that feels so good when you play, but I don't think any game designer would write that in their design document of like, I think this will be good. Like nobody would think that, right? Or like when you have explosions in movies or whatever, the whole idea of using a complete silence right before the explosion, also kind of counterintuitive, but it's so impactful. Like it adds so much. It's also really counterintuitive, but if you have the ability to just experiment with this very easily in real time, then you're going to find those things, which I think is really, really, really cool.
Yeah,
one of my inspirations for Phil at the time was the serendipity that comes from using Unity's post-processing and particle system. You know, you put a particle and then you start just checking boxes, and now your particle is doing this and doing that, and now you got gravity, and just because you have all these options and you can just click and check them. And it's the same with post-processing. I've gotten good, I think, at making any scene look good, even like a few cubes, just by clicking some post-processing. But most of the time I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm just randomly checking stuff until it sort of looks good. And that's what I wanted to replicate with Phil. And now you've got like these 150 stuff you can add, and then you can click more checkboxes. Eventually, if you do it long enough, it's going to be good. It's going to feel good.
Yeah, and sometimes I think you need to see options to see what you actually like. Like it helps to compare. Like if you're working with a client, especially, you know, you can like show them one option and then show them an option that you don't like as much, and then they can be like, oh, you know, I really like that one. It just helps to compare, to realize what, you know, what your taste is essentially. And I think these tools allow you to do that. Like allow you to do that quickly. Yeah, because
like when you only have one sample, that's just a point. It doesn't have a direction. But if you have two samples, you have a direction, right? And then you can sort of guide where you want to go from there, you know. Then you have a space to work in. So more samples. Good.
That was very mathematical analogy. I like it.
Thank you.
I wouldn't expect any less. when it comes to making the asset, or like, yeah, the assets, obviously you have to, if you're making an asset for your own game and you don't plan to publish it on the asset store, usually they're built very specifically for that game to work within that game and that engine, and they're not kind of generalized, right? But when you're making a tool for yourself and for and general audience, you have to kind of like pull it out of its context and make it like not contextual essentially, and so that it can fit into any other context, right? But I'd imagine it when you start approaching something like that, the scope could be endless, right? You can like, you could have a top-down game or a platformer game or an RTS game, and you'd really have to make the tool work for every use case, right? So where do you draw the line when you're building your tool to be like, okay, this is what it's going to do, this is as broad as it's going to be, and that's enough for now until I hear from my community about the tool? I'm just curious what that process is like.
Yeah, I think that's something that is very important, especially when it comes to like the long-term support of whatever it is you're making. Like finding where to draw that line is crucial for you to like scope how much work you're going to put into this thing. And quite often you run into this issue of like, so in my case with Shapes. So Shapes is a vector graphics library that can draw shapes in Unity, and they just define either through code or with components or whatever. So there are a few things that come to mind when people think about vector graphics. One of them is, what about SVG support? That's like one of the most common like vector graphics formats. A lot of people ask about SVG and so forth. And so I've just decided that I am not going to do anything with SVG, because if I even add an export function, people are going to ask for an import function, and an import function is significantly harder. And if I add an import function, people are going to expect me to match the entire SVG spec in terms of features, right? Yeah. Which is enormous, because SVG has been around for a very long time, and it's incredibly hard to do everything that SVG has in real time. So to me, like even adding a tiny bit of SVG support is kind of going to open that door to the feedback that everyone is going to get me of like, why not add this? It's just one more feature, and then you're adding one more feature for like a year, and so there's that. And then another example is like, I have drawn a line and decided that Shapes is just going to be a UI, or sorry, not UI, just a rendering library. So I am not going to add colliders or raycasts, because that adds a significant amount of work, because it's so GPU based. If I add colliders, I suddenly have to do an entire CPU side and replicate everything I've done on the GPU in shaders. And so you have to be really mindful of like what doors you open. And you have to be able to like stand your ground and just say no to some features, especially if you work alone. I know how that feels when you're like with ShaderForge, I like accidentally made the industry standard shader editor as one person who's not even experienced with shaders at that point. So like the amount of support questions you get, you want to make sure that that's limited in scope. You don't want to go too far outside of things just because you want to add that one little feature for someone, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And Renaud, how about yourself?
Yeah, it's the same thing. I think scope is critical. You need to define what you want to do and what you don't want to do. I really like my products to be perfect gems, and when you're a single person doing that, the only way to achieve that is either live forever or have a very small scope. So that's what I do. For example, the top-down engine, it does really well, I think, top-down action games. So if you want to do something in the vein of Hotline Miami, then yes. If you want to do something that also has a top-down camera but is like an RTS, then no. I get that question 20 times a day. Can I do a tower defense game? No. Can I do an FPS with that? No. I mean, technically, yes, you could. But is it the good tool? No, I don't think so. And I like my tools to be perfect for the job, but then they only do that job. And I would rather, that's the kind of tools I like to buy in general. you want products that excel in what they are supposed to do. And I also try to make them easy to extend if you want to like slightly go over the line of one genre or what exactly they are supposed to do. But it's much easier to just design that way. I never completely close the door to suggestions from the users.
Yeah.
But mostly I'm the one driving, or at least deciding what gets into a product or not. If it makes sense. There's a lot of ideas that come not from me, but from the users, of course, or me seeing how they use it and being like, that's not what you're supposed to do with it, but okay, it makes a lot of sense. So now I'm adding that feature, and thank you for the suggestion. But eventually, a lot of people would like to have an FPS camera in top-down engine. That's not going to happen. Because just like SVG support in shapes, you start adding an FPS camera, and now you need dedicated animations or whatever goes into FPS making. That's a never-ending pool of issues.
So you want it to be generalized enough, but focused still. It does the job right. Okay, and you mentioned something about the community surprising you, and that's something I actually wanted to ask both of you. Like on a positive note, was there a moment where you put these tools out there and you get to see people finally use them, and I'm sure that's very rewarding to see the results of what they're making with this thing you've created, and did they ever surprise you with something they've made or a feature that they've suggested and you were like, you know what, I didn't think of that, but I need to work on that because that's exciting? I'll pose this question since you brought it up, Renaud. I'll pose it to you first, and then we'll take it to Freya.
Happens all the time. 2 or 3 days ago, somebody suggested I had to fill a look at feedback, and just you press a button and a transform starts looking at another one. Nice. Extremely basic stuff. In 2 years or 3 years working on that tool, never occurred to me that I should add that. So now it's in the next update. But it's what drives me. I've got a Discord. That's where I interact the most with people, at least where I get to see what they do, because there's like a space where they get to showcase their stuff. And now it's like 6,000 people, posting their stuff in there. So it's a lot of people. Wow. And you get a wide range of experience levels. And so, of course, I've seen stuff made by actual studios that is impressive by itself and probably would have been impressive without feel. But I guess what brings me the most joy is seeing people who are like, well, 1 week ago, I had no idea how Unity worked. And I did this thing. And it's thanks to Phil, in part, at least. And seeing the progress, seeing the journey of people going from complete beginners to, hey, I put a game on Steam. May not be the best game in the world, but I did that, I put this thing. And that, knowing that I had a small part in that, that's very positive feelings.
Yeah, it sounds incredibly satisfying. And Freya, yourself?
I think seeing people make anything using your tools is amazing. It's kind of like I started out as a level designer, and for me that was sort of a similar thing of if I design a level and I see people having fun with something I created, that's really rewarding. So I think it's super cool to see what people create with it. But in terms of feature suggestions, I'm going to sound really self-aggrandizing, but I think most people have really bad ideas when it comes to this, because I spend a lot of time thinking about all of the possibility spaces of the tool and what I want to include and exclude and why I want to exclude something or include something. Mm-hmm. And in almost every single case, it's something I've already thought of. And I usually have a reason for designing it the way that I did. But sometimes there are people who suggest things that I didn't think of, but it's very, very rare, unfortunately, at least for shapes. I think for shader ports it happen more often. But yeah.
That makes sense. It sounds like you really knew what you were setting out to do and make with shapes. Sounds like a good FAQ would do the job there. Like this is what shapes does,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
yes, it sounds
Yeah, I
awesome.
have on the asset store, I have a list of what shapes doesn't do.
Yeah, that
Just to
makes
like
sense.
make it clear, like this doesn't do this thing that you might think it does, like
Yeah,
SVG
that's
support and so forth.
I definitely would recommend that to other publishers, as you know, you need to spend time updating your tool, working on it, and also having a life and balancing your life. So making it clear to your community what you are making and what you are not making is, I would say, a big plus. Do that.
Yeah, and it sucks to have people who like were excited to use your tool and then later they realize they can't do the thing that they thought they would be able to do.
Exactly.
And like that situation sucks, and you don't want to have people in that.
Exactly. So as a final question, or I guess the final to leave our audience with, final thing to leave our audience with, I would love to ask both of you, some advice you have, some takeaways you have from your experience with the asset store, advice for both publishers and for people looking to use assets for the first time, to get started with assets and maybe implement them into your games. I would love to know, let's start with Freya. What advice might you have for people looking to start using the asset store?
We've covered a little bit of this before. Like I think knowing the scope of it and drawing lines for what it should and shouldn't do, I think is really, really important.
Yes.
And I think if you're setting out to make tools, if your goal is to make tools and make a living making tools, I feel like that is generally the wrong approach. I usually have the approach of working on games, like working on a project. And then once I find a gap for a tool where it's like, shit, I kind of want a thing that does this. That's when you know you have a pretty good idea, where there's at least an audience of one person who would, find this tool useful.
Yeah.
Because sometimes I find people who set out to make a tool because they want to make a tool, but they haven't really they don't really have a use case for it. It's just that they're interested in some idea and then they want to make a tool for that and sell it. But the odds of that working out is going to be pretty low. And so I think making sure that you actually have use cases, I think is really, really, really important. So I think that is one of the my approach is always like I don't consider myself an asset store publisher like TM. It's more like I don't make asset store tools. It's kind of like the tools find me and then I decide to release them to the world, sort of.
Right.
Because I've only released 2. So so I think that would be my advice.
That's great advice. And Renaud, yourself?
That's very good advice. On top of that, I would have tried to make sure that the tool you're making matches your expected audience, or at least manage your expectations based on that. If you're making a tool that is extremely technical, because I don't know, you've seen that at AAA studios, that would make sense to have this tool. Be aware that there are a limited number of AAA studios in the world, and if your tool can only be used by very senior technical artists, you're limiting your audience. If you decide to make a tool for beginners, which I would say is more my target audience, at least for the Corgi engine and Top Down engine, make sure that your tool matches their expectations as well. If you start not documenting stuff, if you don't provide enough guidance, if you don't work on the user experience of your tool enough, then there's going to be a disconnect, and people are probably not going to be very much into your product.
Yeah, I think one thing I would also add is that you need to make sure that your product is unique in some way. Like you have to answer the question, why should someone use your plugin instead of this other similar plugin, if it exists? You need to have a good answer for that. If you don't, then you're going to have a really hard time breaking into the market. You need to have some sort of edge that makes it worth it compared to other things.
Yeah, if you can't answer it for yourself, then you probably can't pitch it to an audience. Yeah, that's great advice from both of you. Thank you so much. That's so useful. So where can people follow you, Renaud?
They can follow me on Twitter, I guess. Okay. And join the Discord if you have questions.
Amazing. So what's the name of that Discord?
That's a good question. I think it's More Mountains. I hope it is.
If it's not more mountains, then maybe it's feel. So look,
If you go to like any of the assets page on the store, you'll find the link.
yeah, so check out more mountains on the asset store. And what's your Twitter handle on Twitter?
Also more mountains.
Also more mountains. Awesome. And Freya, yourself, where can people follow you to see what you're up to?
I am Freya Holmér on Twitter.
Okay.
I am twitch.tv/acegikmo, which is every second letter from A to O. It's a little complicated.
Nice.
Same thing for YouTube, YouTube/acegikmo for my like Unity tutorials and shader stuff. So
Amazing.
if you want that,
Well,
feel free to check it out.
awesome. Make sure to follow Freya and Renaud for some amazing content. They're both extremely active and post great things all the time. Thank you both for joining us. This was an incredible session, very insightful. It was really a pleasure for me to speak to you both, to speak to you again, Renaud, to speak to you for the first time, Freya. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for having us.
All right. Ciao, everyone.
Bye-bye.